So those of you waiting for a seat, there's another table being set up. Thank you so much for your patience. Did I mention I've only been on board for 6 months, and this is my first event, so thank you for being patient with me. So it's such a privilege to be here today to brunch for a cause. We are brunching for the Bay today. Thank you for joining us. Suncoast Waterkeepers had many successes over the past year. Thanks to terrific donors like you and our amazing board and the wonderful leadership of this man right here, Justin Bloom. Justin's going to tell you. Yeah, give him a round of applause. Justin is going to talk to you about some of those successes later on this afternoon. So I want to make 2 announcements before I get started on what is the agenda for today. The first announcement I'd like to tell you about is one of our new programs that's about to launch called Eyes on the Suncoast. Eyes on the Suncoast is a crowdsourcing pollution monitoring program. So that means if you see something, you can say something. You can say it on social media with the hashtag Eyes on the Suncoast. You can say it by putting in the information on our website, or you can say it through a new app called Water Reporter. All that information is going to be posted on our website soon, and we hope that when you're out in the water or you're by the water, you'll let us know if you see something that doesn't look quite right. Whether that's illegal mangrove trimming or sea life that doesn't look healthy or an algal bloom, we want to hear from you. And that's Eyes on the Suncoast, and we look forward to launching that program very soon. The other thing I want to tell you about is that this week is the birthday of the Clean Water Act. And so if you're not familiar with the Clean Water Act will be in law for 50 years, October 18th. And so we're really excited to celebrate 50 years under the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act is the foremost, and because of that Clean Water Act, we've had many successes. There's a QR code up here that says Act 50 next to it, and you can learn more about all the successes for waterkeepers around the nation and around the globe that have worked to protect our waters. So we are just one of 360 organizations under the Waterkeeper Alliance. And so to celebrate the Clean Water Act, the Waterkeeper Alliance did what waterkeepers do best, and that was that they went and they are going to host press releases and all kinds of panel discussions and all kinds of information to try to encourage the EPA to bring about additional restrictions to protect us from these chemicals are really hard to say, but you're going to hear all about them later from Dr. Bowden. Perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances, also known as PFAS or PFOA. So those are chemicals that are forever in our environment, and Waterkeepers Alliance and waterkeepers around the globe, but especially in the United States, are working hard to get the EPA to include standards for these substances in all water quality monitoring and enforcement efforts. This summer, 120 waterkeepers, including our team, went out and collected water samples to find out how much of those PFOA and PFAS substances are in our local waters. And so we tested Bullies Creek, and if you know Bullies Creek and you're familiar with it, we went to the very top of Bullies Creek where it starts, and then we went past the industrial corridor that goes along Bullies Creek. So we did an upstream and downstream sample along with 120 other waterkeepers around the nation. And that report is going to be delivered to the EPA and to our local legislators next week so that we can encourage more action on these contaminants. So what we found was that it actually didn't matter if you were upstream from the polluter or if you were downstream. You had high levels in both areas. And so Miami actually had the highest levels in the state, and so we will learn more about that next week. And actually, you're going to learn more about that from Dr. Bowden. So I want to just tell you about the day. So we're about to have a raffle in a few minutes. So if you haven't bought raffle tickets, you can still buy them from Alex over here. Thank you, Alex, for being our raffle ticket person. And then you need to put them in the bucket if you haven't already into the little containers for your raffle, because we're going to be drawing those soon. We're going to have presentations that start around 12:45. We're going to have Justin Bloom and also Nick Castillo, and they're going to talk to you briefly about different topics revolving around the Clean Water Act and their individual work. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and during that 15-minute break is when you're going to have the last opportunity to do silent auctions. So make sure that you put your name on the silent auction list where you want it, and make sure that if you want to be the winner, that you go check that out. At the end of all the presentations, we'll have questions and answers, and then we will present an award. And by the end of the award, we will do closing remarks, and you can cash out from your silent auction. All silent auctions should stay over there until somebody from Suncoast Waterkeeper presents it to you. So let's leave everything over there, and we will present it to you at the end when you cash out with either Alex, Orion, or myself. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Justin, who's going to make a couple of remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Abby. I'm going to be real brief and just also welcome you. And a little bit later, I'll tell you about some of our successes. But I'd say the biggest success that we've had in the last year is hiring Abby. We really scored. Sort of housekeeping, it looks like we're going to be tight. A lot of people bought their tickets kind of towards the end of the week. So if you've got room at your table and you see someone looking around, just invite them to join you, because my odd math looks like it's going to be a bit tight. Also, I just want to acknowledge some people. First, I want to acknowledge our board. Our chairman, Rusty Chinnis. And Marilyn Parker, and Tom Walker, and I know Allison Albee is right over here, and Orion Morton, Richard Moore and Jose Oranga are traveling, and that rounds it out. But we also have some former board members. Joe McClash, who we're going to be presenting with a special award later, is here in the house. And Jack Merriman is right here, and Sandy Ripberger is with us as well. There's Sandy. So again, thank you very much. We had a pause last year with COVID, and we're so glad to be back on track and hope to continue doing this every year. We really appreciate your support and hope that you enjoy the brunch and the program. Take care.
So we're going to get started with presentations. We're running a little bit behind schedule, which if you know me, that's very stressful. But that's okay, because I can still get a drink and relax. All right, so first up, we're going to have Justin Bloom. And unfortunately, he didn't send me his bio, and you think I should know it because he is kind of my boss. But Justin is awesome. He is the founder of Suncoast Waterkeeper, and he's going to talk to you about the successes of Suncoast Waterkeeper, which really happened under his leadership and the awesome board that you've met here today. After that, we're going to have Captain Nick Castillo. Captain Nick is a graduate student at Florida Atlantic. He is a Florida native, and he grew up in Fort Myers, spending his free time kayaking through the mangroves and seagrass beds of Pine Island Sound and Matlacha Pass. He spent every summer walking the shores of Sanibel Island, armed with a fly rod, searching for snook in the surf, witnessing the yearly discharges from Okeechobee that transformed the water from clear to turbid and tea-like. He decided to pursue the environmental science and sustainability in college. Following graduation from the Nicholas School of Environment at Duke, nice job, Nick promptly moved to Isla in the Florida Keys to begin a career as a backcountry and inshore fishing guide. He specializes in targeting bonefish an important recreational sports fish with a rapidly declining population. He then enrolled in graduate school at Florida International University to pursue a PhD in fish ecology and ecotoxicology. Along with Dr. Jennifer Rehatch and the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, Nick has conducted a study documenting the widespread contamination of bonefish throughout South Florida, the Florida Keys, and the Dry Tortugas. Today, Nick will present the results of this study and discuss the emerging issues of pharmaceutical contamination in the marine and coastal environments. So, Justin's up first, and then Nick, and then we'll take a little break in which you will have 15 minutes to finish your silent auctions. Really great stuff over there. If you've not looked, please go put your name down. Thank you. Justin.
Thanks, Abby. So I'm going to be pretty brief, and the format, I think this is our 8th brunch for the Bay, and typically we have some great speakers always, and everybody at the end compliments us on finding really interesting topics to talk about, and then I take the opportunity to kind of give an update. But I missed last year, we all did, due to COVID. So I'll kind of give you like a real brief overview. I think, this is kind of our core, and you guys know what Waterkeeper is about, but maybe there are some other people. I'll do the real quick. Suncoast Waterkeeper is a local Sarasota Manatee based nonprofit organization. We're one of now, I believe it's 360 waterkeepers around the world. And the model is, it's growing. It's different than other environmental organizations. I think we're well defined by our advocacy and our willingness to take a position, be vocal about it, and litigate. But we work, and that's a bit unique from other organizations that we work with that are a little more science-oriented or education-oriented. And so I think we all work together, but some of the successes that I talk about are really more in the litigation that we've been involved in. But that's not all that we do. As Abby talked about, we have some other programs, Eyes on the Suncoast. We're in the future, look forward first, and then I'll tell you about kind of our successes. I think we're refocusing a little bit in light of the hurricane, and it really kind of like it rattled us all, I think, and thank you for coming. I think it's been disruptive, and it's nice for us all to, after the storm, check in with our friends and neighbors and kind of get out and do something nice. But I think in the future we're going to be looking a lot more at resiliency and the importance of our natural ecosystems and natural infrastructure. Mangroves are going to be really important. I think in Sarasota County, I recall the figure of how 80% of our mangroves in Sarasota County over the years have been removed. So we've got incredible hardened shoreline, and it's happening quickly in Manatee County. So we want to pay more attention to protecting what we have and then working with others to find ways to rebuild that natural resiliency. And then also we're going to be doing some more environmental education, kind of filling the gaps where we don't really see ourselves being the environmental education organization, but want to work with other groups to help provide that platform. But what I'm best at talking about is kind of like what our wins, our successes. In the last couple of years, we've kind of followed through on this campaign that maybe is 6 years running that we called Sick of Sewage. And I think we all are. And in the last couple of weeks, we've seen some really bad, egregious examples of sewage pollution that contribute to the pollution that plagues our waterways and has contributed. And hopefully, the news is there is a large mass of out in the Gulf of contamination, which isn't always, it's not just human pollution, but after this storm has flushed out so much that nutrients from the debris that is piled in front of all of our houses, but that's mixed with millions and millions and millions of gallons of sewage, of failed septic systems, of lagoons, of pollutants that just were overflowing, contributing to this polluted soup that hopefully will not find its way on shore in the form of a harmful algae bloom, which we saw back, I believe, in 2018. We think that might have been the cause of that terrible, or a major contributor of the terrible red tide that we had back then. So a lot of our focus has been on kind of low-hanging fruit when it comes to that type of pollution, and that's sewage. Because the Clean Water Act has a very, very strong mechanism to bring polluters into compliance if, and this is the key thing, and unfortunately why we're so busy, is if the regulators and the enforcers don't do their jobs, which I don't think that they are, then we can step in their shoes and bring actions under the Clean Water Act, which is a very powerful 50-year-old now environmental law, which, by the way, was supposed to, their horizon, I think that the plan was in 1972 to make all of our waters fishable, drinkable, swimmable, and I think it was like 10 years. I should have that figure, but so we're not doing so well. And our bays have continued over, since that time, to make great recovery, much of which we measure by the health of our seagrass populations. But in the last many years, I think 7 or 8 years, we've been seeing declines, which is an indicator of declining water quality. I think we have a lot of work to do. Back to kind of the sewage wins. We started with a lawsuit against the city of St. Petersburg, and that was after a summer of spills where St. Pete accounted for more than half of the sewage spills throughout the entire state of Florida, just from the city of St. Pete. We dug in and saw a real failure, and this is the story that it's the same with all the other cases that we've brought, a failure of these municipalities to maintain a working sewage system. It's easy to put up a public work of art or something glitzy that elected officials can get behind. It's a lot harder to spend a lot of money, and this is what's really important, spending a lot of money on infrastructure that people don't really see and might take for granted. And that was the story in St. Pete, and we've seen it elsewhere in the failure to maintain basic infrastructure that leads to a crumbling sewage system. And it's getting worse and worse as we see more intense storms. The collection systems that take the sewage from all of our houses and businesses gets overwhelmed when there's a big storm. And this last hurricane was a perfect example of it. I'll talk a little bit about Bradenton at the end, but Bradenton dumped more than 15 million gallons of sewage just over the last several weeks due to the storm. So our first battle in St. Pete was really hard fought. We had to litigate for over 2 years. It was the first one, and there aren't a lot of examples in the state of Florida of bringing this type of citizen suit. We were perceived as like environmental terrorists by some of the councilmen. But we felt like while it was uncomfortable and our members live in these municipalities and we don't want to sue ourselves and our neighbors, but we felt like this was action that we had to do. And ultimately, after 2 years of hard litigation and some really good federal court rulings, which are going to be helpful around the country, we succeeded in St. Pete, and this is the model for these cases, in being forced to adequately investigate the deficiencies in their system and make the proper investments to make them resilient, to function properly, and to accommodate future growth. And as part of that is also, in all these cases, is better public notification and outreach to let the communities know not only about the spills, but also about the good stuff. The work that their crews are doing to line the sewer in front of your house. Just better outreach and communication. So that led to another successful case with Gulfport, also Pinellas County. Then while working on these cases, we looked in our backyard in Sarasota and realized that the Sarasota County had been their main largest sewage treatment plant had been discharging partially treated sewage into Philippi Creek for, it had been about 8 years. The tune, and we only went back because of the limitations in law. I think we went back 6 years, but my calculations, it came to about 1 billion gallons that was going ultimately into Roberts Bay. And adding to the problems that Roberts Bay and elsewhere in Sarasota Bay had with too much nitrogen. This wasn't a problem of like pathogens, and because Philippi Creek has enough problems with failing septic systems, as do other tidal creeks in our area, but this was partially treated sewage that just had extremely high levels of nutrients that then algae will feed on and cloud the water, retard the growth of our important seagrasses, and fuel red tides. That case was a little different than how I explained St. Pete. They really fought us tooth and nail. To give Sarasota County credit, I think that they realized, and I don't think the commissioners really were aware of what had been going on for so long. Their approach was very, very different. And I don't think this one's working. And it was more of a collaborative approach of working with our great engineers to come up with solutions. And then Sarasota County went above and beyond. Our lawsuit was really kind of limited to the operation of this sewage plant and then also sewage spills throughout the system. But Sarasota County embraced the need for investment in their environmental infrastructure and committed to upgrading all of their sewage plants to advanced wastewater treatment, which is going to have an incredible. We've seen the effect of the stopping the discharges into Roberts Bay. If you look at the data that has been collected by our environmental partners and the estuary program and others, we're seeing a rebound. We're seeing recovery. But imagine the recovery or how much of a difference that's going to be when Sarasota County, it's going to take years and cost millions of dollars, it upgrades their system to advanced wastewater treatment. And so I'd like to give them credit for that. After Sarasota, we brought a similar case against Largo with a similar success. And then Bradenton, which is close to home and right across the river, they also, the history of just having these very massive spills that were going into the Manatee River from 9th Street East, which is passed upriver from the hospital. On the Bradenton side, there's a discharge that when there were big storms, the treatment system would be overwhelmed. They didn't have the capacity to treat it all because stormwater got in through all the cracks in the pipes, and they had to what we call bypass. And so there were every year for the last several years these incidents, a couple times a year, where they had to bypass mostly raw sewage straight into the Manatee River. And so after last summer, we saw more of these bypasses. We said this is another case that we really need to bring, and settled a few months ago. And also to give the city of Bradenton credit, they also recognized the deficiencies and worked collaboratively with us to come up with some resolutions. And all these settlements, they're going to take a number of years where we continue to oversee the work that they need to do and that they've committed to do to bring their sewage systems into compliance with the Clean Water Act. I've spent way too much time talking about poop while you guys are eating. Sorry. There are a couple other cases I want to talk about. I mean, these aren't enforcement actions that we're bringing, but we've become more and more vigilant about losses to our mangroves. And that's where this Eyes on the Suncoast seeks to get you guys more involved to help identify illegal mangrove trimming where and when you see it, particularly in Manatee County. Sarasota County has a regulatory program. Manatee County relies on the state's resources, which are inadequate, I think. So we highlight these, we research, we photo document illegal mangrove trimming, whether it's a single parcel on a canal or whether it's Aqua, Carlos Barouf's giant development. We'll bring it to the attention of DEP, but if we just do that, then it'll get brushed over, and we've seen that they just haven't enforced the law. So then we keep on them, and we keep on them and keep on them and keep on them. And Rusty's out there taking drone footage and documenting it every week. And hopefully you guys will do that as well. And then the other case that's coming up is the fish farm that is been approved by the EPA for development off the coast of Sarasota, South Sarasota. It's going to be about, I think, 40 miles offshore. And this is an industrial fish farm that, while we really support aquaculture and we promote it, and we have partnerships in the area in promoting onshore bivalve aquaculture and even land-based recirculating farms. Offshore aquaculture, I think, comes with a lot of hazards and a lot of risk. And that risk, we don't think, was adequately evaluated in the course of the granting the permits by the federal government. So the EPA reviewed their proposal, and they did not do a thorough, what we call a full environmental impact study. So our lawsuit, which we filed a challenge with some other environmental partners in DC federal court, basically saying that we're not philosophically opposed to offshore finfish aquaculture, which a lot of people are, but we think that before granting this, before letting it occur, you need to do a full environmental review to see what the potential impacts are. And one of the things that we highlighted in our comments was, what happens when there's a hurricane? That fish farm where it's located would have been just decimated by that hurricane. And I think if they were to go ahead with that, I mean, it's in Hurricane Alley. So we're going to be fighting hard for you folks on that case in federal court. And then I think there will be other actions, and especially with our with Abby at the helm now, you're going to be hearing more from us and hopefully sharing in our good deeds. So that's my brief kind of update, and thank you so much for attending. I can take a quick question, sure.
Are you involved in any lawsuits against the state of Florida relative to Piney Point?
Thank you for mentioning that. We are. And yeah, so that's another case that is ongoing that we, thanks again, we jumped in right when Piney Point, I mean, we were very aware of the conditions at Piney Point, and when that disaster occurred, we took action, not only by bringing litigation, but we were out there as a platform for press and other stakeholders to gain access to the waters around there to determine the impacts, to raise public awareness about it. And then when we realized the significance of it and started becoming more aware of the failed history of the state's failure to adequately take care of that risk there, we brought a federal lawsuit with our environmental partners. And unfortunately, that lawsuit is kind of stalled right now, but we keep on pressing forward. If it's not in the courts, we're going to press forward with every other tool at our disposal.
So we're going to take questions at the end. We have like 20 minutes for questions and answers. If you can't remember the question, that's okay, because there are index cards on your table. You can write down the question, and that way you will remember to ask it at the end. Thank you so much. If you need more index cards, we have some up front. If you need better pencils, we've got those too. So you can just raise your hand and I'll be happy to come by. All right, Nick, you are up. Thank you. And after Nick, we'll take a brief break. Yes, thank you, Justin. We forgot to give Justin a round of applause. Thank you, Justin. Take it away, Nick.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Okay, I will project. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Justin, Abby, thanks for having me. Wow, it's fantastic to hear about all the work you guys have done. Okay, I'll focus on this one here. How's that in the back, everybody? Awesome. Yeah, so as they mentioned, my name's Nick, and I'm from Florida International University, and I work with the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust as well. Today, we'll discuss some of our recent research looking at pharmaceutical contaminants in bonefish, and we focused in Miami-Dade County and Monroe County. Now, we just had a very long discussion of water quality issues, but I'll just reiterate it as far as it being something very important and concerning when we have issues with that locally, globally, particularly here in Florida. And it goes without saying, but poor water quality definitely affects ecosystem health, functionality, sustainability, all things that we're very concerned about, sitting here in this room, enjoying, recreating out there in the water behind us. Now, I like to think of maybe two different categories of water quality issues. There are those visible threats. So that's an algal bloom. There could be sediment plumes. Let's say we're having construction and there's runoff. So those are things we can see, and that kind of sounds the alarm that something's going on. But then there are invisible threats that I like to think of as they're there. We don't necessarily know or see that they're there, and they might be having effects that aren't readily apparent or visible. And pharmaceutical contaminants are among those. They could be in our waters, and without testing, we wouldn't necessarily know that they're there or that they're in our fish. And water quality supports a very effective and important recreational fishery here in South Florida. So in Florida, we have the highest economic impact, the most anglers in the United States, and the highest quality of fishing. So it's big bucks, right? It's a very important economy down here. We have about, let's say, $10 billion annually just in the state of Florida for recreational fishing. And we have a lot of anglers, so 22 million trips every single year. That's a lot of people fishing. We also have quite a good fishery, so 15% of all of the fishing world records for recreational fishing right here in South Florida, or Florida, excuse me. Now, to the parts that I think a lot of us here resonate with a little bit more. So recreational fishing is a key component of identity and culture. It's a lot more than just the economic aspect of what it brings to our state. It's a lot of the reason why we're here. We have a lot of people here that might support their industry and their livelihood. All right, so back to pharmaceuticals, and we all know what those are, right? Those are drugs that we take every single day. They keep us healthy, incredibly important. We have about 5,000 different pharmaceutical prescriptions that are actively being prescribed, and let's say over 300,000 over-the-counter medications, with a little bit less known about those, not as highly regulated. But what's happening is that when we take this drug, it's affecting a little bit more than just our own bodies. It could go ahead and enter our wastewater treatment systems, enter the aquatic environment, in which case it's not necessarily something good, but it could pose a risk. Yeah, we enjoy our drugs here in the United States. So about 18 30-day prescriptions per person each year on average. And yeah, it's quite a bit, right? We have 6.3 billion prescriptions in 2020, the most recent year, with some data. And it would be interesting to see what we have in 2021 after COVID. That'll be exciting. 50% of the global consumption is in the United States. And here in Florida, we are third within the United States. So it's something that's happening quite a bit. We take a lot of drugs. Now, let's put that into perspective with some of the other environmental things that we concern about. So let's say atmospheric CO2, chemical industry, and the figure behind me is showing the proportional change since 1970. So we see atmospheric CO2 is increasing, the human population is increasing, but consumption of pharmaceuticals is exponential. So what's happening is that we're going outside of something called the safe operating space. So we are producing pharmaceuticals and consuming them at a rate that's much faster than what would be able to actually understand what is exactly happening. Are they entering an environment? So the pace is it's outpacing us to be able to regulate and manage the pharmaceutical production and consumption. Now, how do pharmaceuticals become pollutants? So we've spoken a lot about pharmas. How are they out there? When you take a drug, let's say only a certain proportion could be metabolized, sometimes let's say 10% of the drug, and then the rest of that is excreted. And once it's excreted, a lot of the times that remains in its active parent state, and then we flush it down the toilet. And after that, in the state of Florida, 2/3 of households are on sewer and 1/3 is in septic. So let's say a lot of our sewer systems and wastewater treatment plants are a little bit old, outdated. Let's say there's some leaky pipes. There can be effluent from there. And also in septic systems, without them being maintained, there could be leaks, and those can also leach into our coastal and our canals and coastal ecosystems. And pharmaceuticals from wastewater treatment, they're not removed, which is when wastewater treatment plants were put into place, pharmaceuticals weren't something that we were considering removing. They're focused on removing different types of contaminants from our water. Now, there's a number of different routes with which they could reach our coastal environments. So there's ocean outfall, and I'll discuss after this a little bit Miami-Dade and Monroe County, because that's where I focused my study. But we have ocean outfall, there's deep well injection, where we inject the water into the deep aquifers in Miami-Dade. That's the Biscayne aquifer. And we have shallow well injection, and we use reclaimed water, all of which can still contain the pharmaceuticals since they weren't removed completely through wastewater treatment. Now in Miami-Dade County, we have 3 ocean outfalls that are in, if you guys are familiar with Miami, and then there's the Biscayne Bay area south. We have 3 different ocean outfalls, and they are about within 1 mile of the coast, 1 to 3 miles. And we have the largest volume in the country of water injected into deep wells. And with the deep well injection, it's presumed that there is containment there, that the water doesn't migrate. We don't necessarily know, nor do we have evidence that it's actually migrating, but the signature of the water in the aquifers is similar to that at the coastal shelf, let's say in the Florida Straits. So when we're about 3,000 feet deep in the water signature is the same as the aquifer. So that could be evidence that there is migration or at least connectivity between those aquifers and the Florida Straits. In Monroe County, as I mentioned, we have that was Miami-Dade. This is Monroe. Key West, we have deep water. But what's also interesting is we have shallow well injections. And those are anywhere from 0 to, well, not 0, but like let's say 30 to 100 feet deep. And what's interesting there too, there's evidence that that water can migrate 75 feet per hour. So that water is going to be reaching our surface, particularly let's say sea level rise, let's say there's high tides and we have our porous substrates. So that's another method by which they could reach our coastal waters. Now we know how it gets there, but why is this something that's concerning? So pharmaceuticals, and we're going to hear about some forever chemicals soon, these do degrade. They're not persistent, but they are pseudo-persistent in a sense that if we're continuously introducing them into the environment, then it's just being replenished if they are degrading. So there's a constant supply, and we don't have regulations currently. It's not covered with, let's say, legislation like the Clean Water Act. It just wasn't quite there or concerned about when that was happening. We also have drugs that are designed to be active at very low doses. I mean, we don't want to take a bucket full of pills, so it's a tiny little drug. And the low doses that we find in our ecosystems and in our coastal waters can be at a concentration that can cause an effect. Now you might be asking, these are human drugs, what's that going to do to a fish? They're completely different. But fish share about 70% of the same drug targets. So that human drug, it does something to us. It has the capability of doing the same thing to a fish, but the results can be quite different. So they have effects. They can affect all aspects of the fish life. And we got this is one of the few fish that I think actually was getting a prescription. Otherwise, it's just free. But these aren't contaminants that are actually killing these organisms. They're not at concentrations that are lethal, which is one of the reasons why it's difficult to regulate these. They're not adhering to our traditional forms of regulation, let's say a lethality endpoint. But what's happening is it's altering behaviors, and these behaviors can be very important for survival. Now, a very commonly studied drug are antidepressants, class of drugs. And when a fish is exposed, it increases its feeding rate, it can increase its activity. They become less social, they don't school as much, they're bolder, they take risks, they could be eaten by predators a little bit more frequently. So that's what's happening to the individual, but then it extends beyond that to the population, and then that can even affect the entire ecosystem in which they live. So I'm going to show you guys a very neat little figure here. Now there was a study where there was a lake that was dosed with an anti-anxiety drug, and there are pike, which are the blue dots here, and then that's the predator, and the prey, perch. 2 groups, some were exposed and some were not. And as I start this animation, you'll see that the red dots and the yellow dots start at the same place. I know it's kind of small there. They start at the same place. Those are the predators. What happens? Is it starting? Okay, I'm trying to click there. All right, well, I can't click. But what happens, they're introduced at the same place, and these red dots, the exposed fish, do not stay at the spot where they were released, while the yellow ones do. So those fish that are not exposed, they're exhibiting the behavior they should. The ones that were exposed to the anti-anxiety medication just disperse, and they were eaten quite a bit more frequently. So we've altered movement and activity from the individual to the population. With salmon smolts, when they were exposed, they migrated much more quickly, so their activity was increased. They were eaten much more frequently during their migration, and that reduced survival. If we don't have these salmon smolts reaching the coastal areas, then that would reduce the population and kind of affect their survival. And now let's extend to the ecosystem. So there's an interesting study with crayfish, and when they were exposed, they changed their behavior. And so we've already understand that happens, but what happened after that was that the ecosystem itself actually changed. So we're familiar with chlorophyll and what it can do here in the water. The chlorophyll levels changed in response to to crayfish that had different behavior, but it also changed in the presence of just the drug alone, not with the crayfish. So there's a number of different things happening here that are affecting potentially the ecosystem itself. Now, our study with bonefish. So we wanted to understand if pharmaceuticals are a concern for South Florida fisheries. Bonefish are incredibly valuable recreational sport fish with a recent decline in population. They live near shore and forage in sediment, both aspects that could make them particularly susceptible to being exposed to pharmaceuticals. A couple little more facts. That's a little close-up of our cool little bonefish. There's about 12 species. We have 3, and we studied 1. They live to about 21 years old, and as I mentioned, they're near-shore seagrass habitats, and we've heard a lot about seagrass today. They forage on benthic, so bottom-dwelling invertebrates and vertebrates, both of which can accumulate the pharmaceuticals, and the pharmaceuticals can be in the sediment, so a number of different routes that they could be exposed. Now, bonefish quality, quantity, and size has decreased quite a bit. Behind me is our results of a study looking at a long-term tournament in the Keys. So the decline there is showing the decline in number of fish caught, but at the same time, the size and the qualities, the opportunities at fish, all decrease. There's a recent uptick, you see that green arrow, yay, but we don't necessarily know why, which is still concerning. If we don't understand why it happened in the first place, we might not have solved the issue. Now, our study asked 4 key components. 1, are bonefish being exposed to pharmaceuticals? 2, if so, is it a problem everywhere? And 3, how big of a problem might that be? And 4, how are bonefish being exposed? Is it in their food? So with the first question, are they a problem? We sampled 93 bonefish from Biscayne Bay all the way through the dry tortugas, and we would draw blood from them and analyze that blood for 104 different types of pharmaceuticals. To understand if it's a problem everywhere, we went from Biscayne Bay all the way out to the dry tortugas and dispersed all of those samples along there. How big of a problem? So we're finding these drugs, and they're in the fish, but how do we know if it's actually doing something? It could be there and just maybe not affecting them. So what we took is the concept of a therapeutic plasma concentration. So if you're prescribed a drug, it needs to reach a certain concentration in your bloodstream to actually do something. And so we took a 1/3 threshold, and if it exceeded that, we would presume that the drug had a potential to actually cause an effect. So we took that threshold and compared it to the concentrations that we found. And then how are they being exposed? So we sampled prey items. These are crabs, shrimp, toadfish, various other items in 3 different regions. Let's see if those have pharmaceuticals as well. We wanted to also understand, it's there. Is that what you guys are saying? Yeah. So how are they being exposed? In the trophic pathway. So we want to understand, is it organisms that are in the open ocean, in the bottom, invertebrates or vertebrates? What exactly is contributing to the pharmaceutical exposure? So here are some of our findings and some more beautiful bonefish. So the first thing, let's take a look at that red arrow. We didn't have any zeros. So every single bonefish had at least 1 pharmaceutical with an average of 7 pharmaceuticals in an individual fish. We found 58 different types of drugs with blood pressure medications, antidepressants, and actually a prostate medication being the most common drug that we found. So what's important to note here that we found no zeros, but an average of 7. So if you think back to, let's say you're at a doctor's office, they'll ask, what else are you taking? Drugs can have interesting effects when you're combining a number of them, and it's nearly impossible, very difficult to understand what that could happen or could cause. Now, is it everywhere? So this is one of the things I found fairly surprising. The answer is yes, it was in every single region, but there were differences. So we found high concentrations in Biscayne Bay, the one that's furthest to your left. Excuse me, not concentrations, that's numbers. So that's 10 pharmaceuticals on average per bonefish in Biscayne Bay. But what's surprising to me was the dry tortugas. The dry tortugas are about 75 miles from Key West and fairly isolated, but they had the highest number of pharmaceuticals. So I wanted to emphasize that a little bit. There is precedent. So when we're in an area that potentially has seasonal visitation, that it can increase the amount of pharmaceuticals that are delivered there. Because again, remember, they're traveling with us whenever we go someplace. Now, to understand how big of a problem, the concentrations that we found, over half of the bonefish had at least one drug that exceeded that threshold. So it was above the threshold that could potentially cause an effect in the fish. And again, dry tortugas led the charge as well with higher concentrations in their fish. This is one unfortunate bonefish. This is fish number 43. And fish number 43 had 8 antidepressants, with the highest being up to 300 times the human concentration, which is quite high. And 16 different drugs, so heart medications. It had Parkinson's disease medications, antihistamines, 1 opioid, codeine, just a cocktail of different drugs that are out there. Now, is it in the prey? Every single prey item also had pharmaceuticals. The average was almost double at about 11 different drugs per prey item. We found that the pelagic, so the free-swimming vertebrates, had the highest levels, which was contrary to what we thought, but this could be a very viable route of exposure to these fish. So what we understand is that there is contamination within our water, and we have the lack in ability to remove the effluent from our coasts. There could be, and there is, high exposure in bonefish that is at levels that could have effects. We know that exposure, at least where we studied, is widespread, far and near. And since it's in the prey items, it's also a safe assumption to say, well, if bonefish are eating them, maybe this is more than just a bonefish problem. A lot of other coastal species eat these same prey items. And that's a perfect segue to what we're doing next. So this summer, Andy, who's sitting over there, hey Andy, he traveled throughout the entire state of Florida to collect redfish, red drum. And I'm pretty sure some of you guys go ahead and target them in your backyard here to understand, is this in the entire state of Florida? We sampled in 2 counties, and those 2 counties, we understand they're in bonefish, but is it everywhere? So redfish, they're incredibly important recreational sport fish. What's also interesting is redfish is a fish that's consumed, so we might be able to understand what sort of level of exposure are humans that are consuming these fish experiencing. Again, they also live near shore, forage on the same prey items, but also a couple different ones. Let's say, eat pinfish, pilchards, whitebait, whatever it is you guys use around here. And they are regularly consumed by recreational anglers. This is the extent of our study. So we were in all of those different estuaries, pretty close to your backyard here. We want to understand, are there hotspots? Is it in the entire state of Florida, or was it just an isolated incident in Miami-Dade and Monroe County? And are humans being exposed via consumption? And final question we're asking there is whether pharmaceuticals are impacting fish health. So we'll take that same blood sample and run it for a couple different health indices. So it's one thing to know that they're there, but another to see if we can figure out if something's actually happening to those fish. So I feel like I focus on a lot of stuff. I see a lot of nodding, and maybe I've bummed some people out here, but this is something that I like to think of better to know than not to know, so we understand that this is something that can be fixed. It is an aspect that can be added to wastewater treatment. So there's certain countries that are adding wastewater treatment that helps to remove these pharmaceuticals. We just don't have them in place yet, and that's not the design of our wastewater treatment plants, but with the knowledge that this is something that's occurring, we can go ahead and spearhead it with all of our other aspects that Suncoast Waterkeeper is doing and throughout the state of Florida. So again, we just need to rethink what wastewater is. It's something that's too valuable, but sometimes currently quite damaging, and to reuse wastewater in a way that it provides for a healthy ecosystem rather than contaminating it would be an idealized scenario. So this is our opportunity, Florida. We can do it. We got it. Now, up here is my contacts, and I had the thought, so Abby, I'm going to throw this on you here. I'll leave a piece of paper up on the front desk, and if you guys want to have an update on the redfish projects, we are having those samples analyzed now, and we should have results by the end of the year, and as science goes, that means the beginning of next year, you might have an update. But yeah, please leave your email if you'd like to have an update. And also with the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust Symposium that's coming up in November, keep an eye out for some updates that will continue and add a little bit more to the bonefish study. I don't know how long that was, but okay.
All right, great job, Nick. So 15 minutes-ish break. When you hear my voice, we're gonna get started again. So go to the bathroom, grab a drink, check the silent auction. You're missing out on really great things if you don't put your name down. All right, we'll be back here in about 10 to 15 minutes. I'm excited to announce our keynote speaker for this afternoon. Today we have Dr. John A. Bowden, Assistant Professor in the Department of Physiological Sciences in the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Florida. He's also has a joint appointment in the Department of Chemistry and has affiliations with the Center of Environmental and Human Toxicology and the Department of Environmental Engineering. He received his PhD in analytical chemistry from UF in 2009. After a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at St. Louis University, he joined the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, in 2011, working at the Hollings Marine Laboratory in Charleston, South Carolina, where he would serve as a research chemist until 2018. In his current position, his research is focused on employing novel detection methods at the chem-bio interface with an expanding interest in the fields of environmental chemistry and engineering, exposure science, and small molecule omics. So, that's some heady stuff. I'm not sure what most of it meant, but this guy's smart, and he's going to tell us some really important things about these forever chemicals that are very concerning to Waterkeeper Alliance and to all. So thank you for being here.
Everybody hear me okay? Okay. All right. Sorry. Yeah, thank you for the invitation to speak today. My name is John Bowden. I'm from the University of Florida. Oh, yeah. Go Gators. Who in this room has heard of PFAS before? Oh, okay. Well, that's more than most times I ask that question. So we'll talk a little bit about PFAS. What are PFAS? Give you a little brief summary of things you should know about PFAS. And then talk about some of the research we're doing at the University of Florida. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have at the end of the presentation. PFAS are termed forever chemicals. And they're termed forever chemicals because of how they're made. So as we as a society have come to want more technology, more advancement with the things we buy, we require more of these materials. So chemists in the lab were starting to make all these crazy molecules, and they came up with these molecules that have all these fluorines replacing hydrogens in most molecules that you would experience in organic chemistry. The carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds in chemistry, so it makes it indestructible, or very hard to break down. You also might notice that the way the chemical structure is made, and I promise I won't get too much more into chemistry, they have both a hydrophobic aspect to it, so that helps them repel water. They don't like being around water. That's why PFAS are used in a lot of water-repelling materials. But they also have a hydrophilic end, which allows them to be more soluble in water. And so that allows them to move within water once they're released in the environment. With these characteristics, the non-destructibility of them have made them a problem once they get into the environment. So once these chemicals are released in the environment, what made them great as chemicals when we consume them make them very difficult to manage once they get into our waters. It's really interesting that these chemicals have been used by us since the 1930s. So they were first, one of the biggest applications was during the Manhattan Project. And we've been using them for a long time, but we really haven't been monitoring their effect on our health and our environment. And it wasn't probably until the late 1900s where we started using these chemicals in almost everything, from non-stick cookware to our clothing to firefighting foams. They've become ubiquitous in everything we use and do. In the early 2000s, people started to pay attention to potential health effects of these PFAS chemicals. And it wasn't until maybe the last 5 or 10 years that people actually started to pay attention. It's becoming more publicly known that these things are bad. Unfortunately, we have 90 years worth of use of a non-destructible chemical. You might be asking yourself, what kind of things are PFAS in? And I would tell you, as a chemist, the only samples that we have run that we have not detected PFAS in were from water from the Galapagos. So almost everything we touch in our lab has PFAS in it to some extent. And these are some of the common things. I mean, this list is growing. We've found them in straws, paper straws. We found them in people find them in dental floss. We find them all kinds of food packaging. But some of the things you might think of are just popcorn bags, you know, the cosmetics. There's a big study that was done a couple years ago that found these in cosmetics. Obviously, anything you want to repel water or not be stained, you know, something that won't stain will have these chemicals in it. And those are things that we buy, that we use and consume that potentially have PFAS in them. But what about the things that are threats to our waterways? And these are where we would talk about the aqueous film forming foams. So airports and military bases will have these foams. They spray to put out fires. Once they spray, these things kind of sit and then they seep into their waterways. You also have effluent. So most wastewater treatment plants don't actually remove PFAS. There are some that are starting to look into this because of impending legislation that may be coming. But typically, PFAS are not removed by wastewater treatment plants. And our landfills. So we buy all these products. When we're done using them, we throw them away. They don't just disappear. They end up in a landfill. And for those of you who might know about landfills, things don't necessarily always stay in the landfill. So what are some brief health concerns with PFAS? Unfortunately, I could probably talk for hours up here about all the things that have been associated with PFAS exposure. And I want to say I'm using the word PFAS as a term to collectively describe all the different chemicals that are in this class. And I think last time I checked, there's about 9,000 of these chemicals in use. So the main ways we get exposed are food, probably mostly through food packaging, but there are a lot of studies that are showing that these things are in our crops as well. And that's because of use of biosolids. Water is probably the biggest thing that's drawn public attention. Drinking water, most likely, most of the time near some source of exposure. Our indoor environment, dust, the air we breathe has PFAS in it. And other things like using cosmetics and other personal care products. This is just an example of some things that have been linked to PFAS exposure, and I can tell you this list is growing by the day, especially with cancer. But some of the things that we focus on in our lab are focused on thyroid health, the body's ability to be able to handle and effectively use vaccines, which is obviously very important now. A lot of developmental issues. So if you're expecting mom and you get exposed to these chemicals, it would potentially have an effect on the fetus. And also, these things cross the placental barrier, and they show up in breast milk. So they're highly mobile, and they get into a lot of our health. So one of the things that makes these chemicals scary is that they're extremely mobile in the environment. So there's lots of different potential sources. One could be a chemical plant that basically is using either directly or indirectly these chemicals for their manufacturing process. They have some sort of effluent that they produce that can end up in a waterway, either intentionally or not intentionally. But you also have these emissions, these stacks. They burn stuff off. PFAS are incredibly difficult to burn. Most of the time, they just volatilize, end up in our air, and then they get dropped down in rainfall somewhere else. Landfills are also another place where these things accumulate. And a lot of landfills sell materials like biosolids from the landfills that are land applied. Leachate, which is the garbage juice of the landfills, those get taken to wastewater treatment plants or deep well injected where they're not really removing them, they're just putting them somewhere else. And so these things all end up into our waterways. Then, of course, I mentioned before, we have these foams that are used in airports and other facilities. And wastewater treatment plants don't really effectively remove these. Again, there's thousands of these chemicals. So even if you can remove some of them, there's still others that are being used. And as chemists, as we kind of chase the carrot around the track and try to catch up with all the chemical companies, we finally get to measure some of them they bring out new ones. So it's constantly trying to catch up with them. But why does this matter? It matters because we draw our drinking water from a lot of these areas where a lot of these activities are happening. And that's why you'll see, if you ever Google PFAS and drinking water, tons of stories of cities that have PFAS in their drinking water. That's because something nearby is dumping PFAS and it's ending up into the water supply. Of course, we're on a floating island here in Florida, so we really care about our water here, and so we have to really pay attention to this. So, EPA for a long time has had these health advisory levels for PFAS, and they only had it for 2 of the PFAS, and PFAS and PFOA. And these are, most of the time, the most prevalent ones we find in most samples. Their health advisory level up until this last summer was 70 parts per trillion. And what a parts per trillion would be is a drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, just to give you an idea of what that is. But just this past summer, they reduced the levels to 4 parts per quadrillion. 4 parts per quadrillion is actually below what our instruments can measure. So what EPA is basically saying is that there is no measurable level of these that's safe in our water. And as you want to get an example of what a parts per quadrillion is, it's 2.5 minutes in the framework of the Earth's lifetime. That is a long time. That's a small number. And we have a really big issue because, 1, there's only a couple of these that are actually given health limits, but 2, all the numbers that we had collected from drinking water that were in low parts per trillion are now about 1,000 times higher than what they're saying is safe. And that's actually a problem because a lot of people who regulate this now have to completely change their philosophy and how they manage these chemicals. So what do we do in our lab? Again, not really hardcore chemistry here. I'd be happy to talk hardcore chemistry if anybody wants to after the talk. But we go out and as a lab, so my background is chemistry, and and I'll mention this later, we rely on the water keepers, we rely on partners in local areas, for 1, to tell us about what the local issues are, but also 2, to help work with us to get samples, to talk about data, because not only do we want to make measurements, but we want to actually make a difference with what we're measuring. So we go out and grab water samples or sediment samples or other biota samples. And we take those samples and we do something called extraction. So we remove all the PFAS from the sample and get rid of everything else. And so we've pre-concentrated the stuff we're looking for. And that's how we're able to measure into the parts per quadrillion realm. And then we measure our samples, our extracts, on a mass spectrometer. We measure 92 PFAS. One of the issues with actually measuring PFAS is that a lot of the companies that make these chemicals do not provide standards. So the proprietary information. So we actually can't validatively quantify a lot of these chemicals. And then we get the data, and then we provide some sort of concentration that we share with everybody that we're working with. As I said before, PFAS are highly mobile. So, we talked about a lot of different sources, but what happens when they get into the water? Where do they go? And again, there's a lot of different chemistries involved in this class of chemicals, but we want to try to understand where they go so that when we go out to a place, let's say after a hurricane, where is the best place that we need to be sampling to get a good idea of what's happening to the environment? And so you have to factor in things like wind and current, whether or not these things actually sit in the water column or they drift to the bottom of the ocean. And once they get there, are they redistributed into the water column? Do they get taken up by biota or other organisms? Trying to figure out where these things go in their lifetime is very important to understand both the long-term threats, but also the short-term happenings that may be going on, like spills, for example. And this is important for us, too, not only because we care about our water, but we also typically consume a lot of seafood and a lot of fish. And as you may have heard, when you have these chemicals released in the environment, they get taken up by the small organisms, that get eaten by other organisms, and then so forth and so on. It goes up to trophic level, and you have this thing called bioaccumulation and bio magnification. So you have what maybe started out as a small concentration, now ending up in a large concentration in animals that we consume. And that now becomes an issue for us and our health. So back several years ago, it seems like yesterday, but a lot longer than I put this number up, 2017. And we were really interested in looking at some of these apex predators, things that consume a lot of fish, that live in areas that we would live, and try to understand what levels do we see. And so we did a study where we looked at American alligator, and we took a cross-section of the southeast, and we actually found that the highest levels that we were finding were at Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge in the Indian River Lagoon. And that area, Kennedy Space Center, they use a lot of these foams, and you're also near the Patrick Air Force Base, which also uses a lot of foams, and there's the Banana River, which is not really a highly flushed ecosystem. But what's really interesting is that when we did a lot of animals, over 200 animals, we actually were able to monitor what levels we found and where they were being found at. In some of the areas where we found the highest levels were actually near the spots where they were doing these firefighting foam activities and the shuttle launch. And then when we looked at specific ones, so this is PFOA, for example, we were finding high levels in other areas too. And one of the areas that I just wanted to point out was that when we didn't know why it was high there was actually an old artillery range. And it used to be, back in the day, they used to line bullets with PFOA. So, you just kind of go back into history and try to find out all these different things that we've used these chemicals for. So I had a student that was in my lab, and they were very interested in working with manatees. And, typically most PFAS research focuses on those things that consume fish, right? And like dolphins and other fish and sharks. We were interested in manatees because manatees don't eat fish, right? They're a herbivore. And so we went to the Indian River Lagoon and a couple other sites, and we looked at whether or not they had PFAS. And sure enough, those in the IRL had high levels of PFAS, almost predator-like levels. And we did some really interesting work working with a lot of people who do manatee health assessments, and we were able to measure the amount of PFAS that they had in these little dried blood spot cards, which is a common human medical technique. What that got us to thinking is, okay, well, why do manatees have PFAS, right? I mean, that's not really something we would expect. And so we started a study that's been going on for about the last year, where we've been collecting samples from known manatee habitats, and there's a list of them up there. And we wanted to look at both water, sediment, and seagrass as potential ways that they may be getting exposed. Now, what's very interesting is that manatees are freshwater drinkers. So, if they're swimming in the salt water, they're not really drinking that water. They drink from freshwater sources. Oftentimes, we hear stories of them going to docks when people are just shooting hoses into them. I don't know what's in that water, but that's also a potential source. We haven't tested that yet. So we have data on sediment and water and seagrass for all those sites, but I'm just going to focus on Sarasota because obviously you guys care about that here. And this is an example of some of the PFAS we measured in surface water. Now, I just want to point out that some of the dots look small, but even those dots that are small are much higher than they're supposed to be in terms of the new EPA health advisory level. So don't make the small dots make it seem like there's not a problem. So we measured PFAS in almost every sample that we collected. And looking at the sediment as well, we found lots of PFAS in the sediment. We don't really know yet why we see high levels in certain areas, but we're hoping to do more sampling to keep trying to understand what the reason is. And this puts a perspective of the sum of PFAS that we monitor across all sites. And what I just want to point out is that Sarasota is actually not at the top of this list, but I just want to point out that our sampling is biased, right? So maybe we sampled in the wrong spots in some places and the right spots in others. So we need to do more sampling. We need to do more longitudinal sampling that are more than just a snapshot to really understand the full impact of PFAS in this area. What's really interesting, and I didn't know this until my student pointed out, is that manatees eat a lot of seagrass. So they eat about 100 to 200 pounds a day. That's a lot. And so we went out and we collected seagrass from all the different sites. And we were really interested to see whether or not PFAS incorporated into the seagrass. And sure enough, it did. And this is an example of a map of seagrass we collected in the Sarasota area. And we found much more PFAS in the seagrass than we had anticipated. So now, what this means in terms of the manatee health, we don't know. But we're also very interested in seagrass health as well. So once these PFAS chemicals get into the seagrass, does it have any negative impact on their health? That's something we're currently focused on assessing. So our objectives of our group are to do environmental surveillance. I think that's apparent from the data that I've just been showing. We're also interested in fate and transport. We do a lot of analytical workflows. Toxicology is something that I won't be able to talk about much today, but that's something we do in our lab as well, and looking at health assessments. But a lot of the work we do is really reliant on community partners. And community partners are huge because they know where to sample, they know the problems in the area. And so over the last several years, we've been doing a lot of work where we've got YouTube videos that show people how to do the sampling. We send all these kits to them. They go out and do the sampling for us. That's really how, as you'll see in the next few slides, we've taken our operation from a small level to pretty much a statewide project. And one of our successes is working in the IRL with local partners doing longitudinal sampling. So there's been a lot of PFAS exposure there. There's a lot of concern about health. And just because there hasn't been anything in this area or other areas doesn't mean these things don't exist. It just so happens that there's very concentrated levels of PFAS in this area. But working with partners, we've been able to do these longitudinal samplings. So you go multiple times, you start getting a good baseline of what's there, and we can actually start understanding what level of concern we should have about these chemicals. And by doing this, we also are sampling fish and other samples as well. This is some data, and I mentioned before that we measure 92 PFAS, and so there's a list of several more that we're measuring here. Some of them are very new that we haven't actually measured before in samples, and we don't actually know the toxicological information from many of these chemicals. So we know they're there, we know they're probably bad, but we don't know exactly how bad. But one of the sites that we sampled had 100 PPT, so that's obviously quite high from where we should be with our health advisory levels. By using some really cool statistical methods, we can actually create these cluster maps. We actually can look at what similarities we see in the profiles across different locations, and we can actually start to understand potentially where some of the sources might be, or where some like PFAS might be being released into the environment. So this is something that we're trying to get into with how we use our data, help us understand, one, like what the data means, but two, if there is a release of chemicals, where is the best place to sample so we can actually assess what's happening. Over the last 2 years, we've been working on this project, what I call the Florida Maps Project, and we've collected over 2,600 water samples across the state of Florida, and with the idea that we're going to be measuring PFAS in them. All the samples have been run, and we're in the last stages of analysis. And just as an example of what this will look like, so on the bottom of this page, I have my website for this project. It's kind of under construction, so if you go there and some of the pages aren't complete, that's fine. By the end of the year, the goal is to have all this data presented online, so you could click on your county, you could click on the actual point that's on the map, and you can see what PFAS we found in the concentration. So this is an example of Pinellas County. This is an example of Manatee County, and this is Sarasota. All counties will be there, and we'll be publicly sharing all of this data. Yesterday I was out with Rusty. We were collecting some sea foam. So again, one of the things we're really interested in is where do these PFAS chemicals go when they get into our environment, and it turns out that they like to accumulate in foams. And so we were out yesterday, we were collecting some sea foam, and one, as try to understand what's happening to them when they get in the environment, but two, maybe sea foam may be an indicator of high levels of PFAS in the waterway that's near where this is occurring. Only a few more slides left. One of the things that I just want to mention too is that PFAS are everywhere, and they keep surprising me. So we had a project with some people at USF where we measured PFAS in fish that were collected hundreds of meters below the ocean surface, and we still found PFAS. So these things, when they get in the water, they move around everywhere. So I'm never surprised. So some of the things that we also do in our lab, like I said, we do environmental monitoring. We also have a lot of work looking at PFAS and waste streams. So we found PFAS in street sweepings, in compost, in landfill leachate, other effluents, biosolids. We are very interested in measuring PFAS in the household. Dust in your house is a source for a lot of PFAS exposure. We actually just submitted a paper looking at PFAS in used air-conditioned filters. And we found a ton of PFAS in the dust that's collected. So don't skimp out on your air filters. But we also are very interested in the PFAS in cosmetics and other things that we typically use. Sunscreen, for example, has PFAS in it as well. And also, we just published, and a guy accepted a paper looking at PFAS in public swimming pools, which, in fact, does have PFAS, too. And then we also, again, do some biomonitoring. So we work with a lot of universities or government partners to look at PFAS in sharks and manatees and alligators and try to understand how these things move in these environments we're working in. So I know it's doom and gloom. And luckily, I didn't speak before you guys were eating, so that's always a good thing. But some of the things you can do that would help, I would say, is volunteer. We're always looking for people willing to help us sample. We have hundreds of volunteers that work with us to try to sample during storms and try to do some routine monitoring. Educate yourself. So, I recommend Googling PFAS and looking at what's happening with that in Florida, for example. You can also look at the Environmental Working Group. It's a great website to go. They have this PFAS map here where they've got measurements of PFAS in drinking water. Now, it looks like North Carolina and the Northeast is high with PFAS, but don't let that fool you. That just means that they test more. So if other places test as much, they would be just as blue. Also, this reduction of this requires a change in our behavior. So we have to really think about what we're using, what we're throwing away. That's going to help us reduce the levels that we find in the environment. And also obviously support your local organizations as well that do this. This work is expensive. It takes a lot of time and resources to do. So those contributions are extremely helpful. And I just want to say that a lot of this work, or a lot of work my group is done by my students. So I'm up here, I get to talk about all this stuff, but they're the ones doing the work. And so I very much appreciate them. And again, if you have any questions, you can email me. I would be happy to talk about PFAS. I always find there's three types of people. There's people who don't want to know anything about PFAS. They don't want to know anything. There's people who want to know until they know, and then they don't want to know anymore. And there's people who want to know. So just figure out which one you are, and I'll have that certain discussion with you. And again, all this really is about educating yourselves, educating the next generation, because this problem will probably be the biggest contamination story we experience, and the next several generations, because these chemicals are not going away. They're still being manufactured. They're still being used. And they're still around. And they will be for decades. So we have to figure out how to live with them, how to mitigate them, how to remove them, how to destroy them. And I think with that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
All right, thank you so much. We are going to collect question cards. So if you have any question cards, please hold them up and Alex will come around and collect them. Also, can Nick come back up here? Can we have Nick and Justin? Because there are questions for all of you. Nick, Justin, and Dr. Bowden. Oh yeah, and Andy too, because Andy's done a lot of the work. Thank you. All right, so if we have any question cards, please give them to Alex. We only have one microphone, so we're doing this kind of odd. So if you want to ask the question out loud, that's okay. I'll just repeat it. Okay. All right, so this is kind of like a raffle. I'm going to pick the one I can read easiest first. If you take a pharmaceutical, where should you pee if you don't want it to contribute to the problem? That is a great question.
All right, we're starting off with a fun one. So if you take a pharmaceutical and you don't want to be part of the problem, let's see here. The best course of action that we have would be to pee in the toilet still, but it's going to go through wastewater treatment. The urination issue, the only solution that I can think of is improving our wastewater treatment to actually remove it. It's still going to be in your urine when you pee, but a note on drugs that are being disposed of. So let's say you have a drug that is expired and you don't want it any longer. Well, there are take-back programs, which are difficult to find, unfortunately, but one of the best ways that you can dispose of it would be putting it within the bottle and diluting it and in the trash. And that is still not an ideal solution because we just had a very long explanation about how that leachate doesn't necessarily stay in the landfill, but that could be the best way to dispose of your unwanted drugs.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, so a question for Dr. Bowden. Media says they found a way to destroy PFAS. Is that true?
I would say that there's a lot of really great research focused on destroying PFAS. And the problem is scalability. So you can develop techniques that work on the bench, and they're really effective, but actually applying those into the water behind me is a much different task. So yes, there are advances to destroying these things, but we're still a very long ways away from deployment and actually applying those into real world settings. So again, Debbie Downer again, I'm sorry.
That's me at every party. All right, so the next question is for Justin. Justin, somebody wants to know, how are our bays doing? And specifically, like the bays around Longboat Key. Do you have an answer for how have they improved after the last hurricane and after the last harmful algal bloom?
Thank you. So I've been following Dr. Tomasco's kind of updates on this. He's the director of the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program, who's been following it, and I post these on our Facebook as well. So he's been doing some sampling. We've been doing some sampling as well. As you can imagine, I was talking about this earlier, there's a tremendous amount of stormwater that has flushed into the bays as a result of the hurricane. And as Dave predicted, it would take a little while for any issues to start to manifest. And they are. So we're seeing low oxygen levels in the southern bays. That's because of just a tremendous amount of fresh water, which has a different density. We're having some small algae blooms that I've heard of in the southern bays. In Sarasota Bay around Longboat, it seems like it's fared fairly well. There's a lot more flushing there. The residence time is a big factor in water quality in general around here. So the bays further in the south, it takes longer for the bays to flush the water out into the Gulf with the tidal action and the other inflow from the tidal creeks. So the slower the residence time, probably the more issues you're going to see. And as I said before, there's some serious concern about conditions further out in the Gulf of what looks to be a large algae bloom, which, and that's from the storm, it's also from upwelling, from 100,000 different factors. But the concern is that going to get pushed towards the near shore and then further be fueled by anthropogenic sources of pollution and nitrogen that could turn it into a super bloom.
Seagrass, is it Seagrass Recovery?
Seagrass Recovery is tracked annually. We've saw a decline over the last several years, but there is evidence that they're actually recovering again. But again, that has to do with the clarity, which we need to make sure that we try to keep these nutrients out of the bays to allow for seagrass to grow.
Justin, just a quick point on that too, that the reports of the seagrass health, the southern bay, which has been the problem area, has now, this is before hurricanes, are now doing better than the northern bays, which are better flushed, which we think is directly tied to Philippine Creek and the wastewater treatment improvements from Sarasota County. But maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's what Dave Tomasco said to me.
Awesome, thank you. So the next question is for Nick. Nick, this is a two-parter. What is the per sample cost of the pharmaceutical assay? And also, how do you think the fish and the dried tortugas got all those pharmaceuticals?
For the first part, I might lend Dr. Bowden after me since his lab does a lot of that. But they're very expensive to have analyzed. The true cost of each sample that we ran is about $1,200. Yeah, but we had. I want to hear what he has to say after this. We did have them subsidized by our collaborators in Sweden. So we work with a lab in Sweden that does a lot of the work with pharmaceuticals and how they affect fish behavior. But that's one of the prohibitive things here. It's really expensive to analyze them, and a lot of the points that Dr. Bowden brought up, to be able to get a full snapshot of what's going on, it requires a lot of sampling, which is a lot of time and a lot of money. I'd be interested to hear what his lab does there. But for the dry tortugas, I can think of 3 different explanations as to why we might find higher concentrations. So septic tanks are a potential source, and there is one septic tank in the dry tortugas. One interesting thing about septic tanks is that they do not remove acetaminophen, so Tylenol, but wastewater treatment plants are actually pretty effective at removing Tylenol, acetaminophen, and that's one of the more common drugs that we found in the dry tortugas. It's possible that it's from the septic tank there. Now, most of the visitors at the dry tortugas use a, a porta potty where it's dry waste, so it's actually trucked out. So that wouldn't necessarily be a source. But the second main point would be ocean currents. It's kind of a convergence of currents from, let's say, the Gulf Stream and in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's also a little bit of an eddy. These pharmaceuticals can remain active for the amount of time that it would take to go, let's say, from the Keys all the way to the dry tortugas. And the third is potentially migration of the bonefish themselves. So those bonefish are mobile enough that they could go from Key West all the way to the dry tortugas. It's really difficult to pinpoint exactly why, but we're continuing with the analyses on that front. I don't know if you want to.
Do you want to answer? Go ahead.
I mean, yeah, it relates to the
How
PFAS
much?
as well, how much they.
Usually, so our assays usually cost about $100 to $150 a sample.
We need to have a beer later.
Yeah, you can go to 99 bottles
That's
to get
true.
that beer. There's coupons on every table. All right, I'm trying to get organized here to ask the next question. Are there any alternatives to PFAS in like industrial products that are safer that you know about?
I would say the problem with that is getting the companies to change their formulas and their strategies. So they like to make a profit. They like to sell their goods. And so it's incredibly difficult to make them change into alternatives. One of the issues with PFAS is it's not currently labeled a hazardous substance. And the government can't really enact on all its levels until they call them hazardous substances. One of the reasons why they haven't done this yet is because, as you might expect, companies don't want them to label them hazardous substances. So there's a little tug and pull here between government and industry. Until they label them hazardous substances, nothing's really going to change, unfortunately. Another Debbie Downer, sorry. One of these times, maybe I'll have something positive to say.
All right, so a lot of these questions are repeated. Do you have any additional questions that haven't been asked? If so, raise your hand. I see one hand, 2 hands. Do I see a third hand? No, I'm just kidding. John Ryan, what's your question?
Yeah, so Justin, you talked about having to do this litigation because the state and federal government who have the regulatory authority are not doing the job. And you and I know, and perhaps others, they used to. 15 years ago or 20 years ago, EPA would come down here and be very seriously pushing for the kind of discharges that we are now litigating. DEP the same way. They were very serious regulators. Now they aren't. They still take our money. We still pay them to do the regulatory job, but they don't do it.
I'm going to repeat his question into the microphone. So why is it that the FDP and the US EPA continue to take public dollars but do not enforce against polluters? Is that legal?
So it's a good question and it's frustrating. And I think the answer oftentimes will end up being at the ballot box. I think we need leadership. These are regulatory bodies that are guided by policymakers that are elected and folks that can take actions to enforce these regulations and that are willing to fund these agencies too. A lot of the times you've got, it's clear that the regulations exist. It's the job of these bodies to do it, but there's no funding. That's particularly in the state of Florida. Our environmental agencies were significantly defunded. So I think we need leadership in the legislature and the executive office, and I think we all have a say there. Good question.
Can I just say something? Yeah. So obviously, like he was saying, you guys need to vote and be at the ballot box, and you need to educate other people in your community about PFAS. Because they only started talking about this in the government after people started getting upset that it was in their drinking water and in their fish. And you need to be vocal with that and make a change. I do know that government is interested in looking at PFAS, but typically government is very retroactive. They're not proactive. And so being a voice in your community is how they'll listen. And that will then be the best way to change, at least my opinion.
All right, so I know that Jennifer Schaefer had a question. Did you raise your hand? Yeah, okay, go ahead, and I'll repeat it.
Sure. John, knowing what you know, where does your family get your drinking water?
Okay, so the question was, you guys heard it, knowing what you know, where does your family get your drinking water?
Yeah, so they actually have found PFAS in drinking water, bottled drinking water. So it's important you know where you get your source. Reverse osmosis is, to date, the best way to clean up your water, nanofiltration as well, but reverse osmosis is probably the best option for cleaning your water. So.
That's a positive answer.
Yeah, it's very positive. And also, the Environmental Working Group has a great guide for water filtration. So if you ever want to do a deep dive into how they make different water filters, I suggest you go there. Okay, the next question is, would the Clean Water Act apply to pharmaceuticals?
So I believe I have someone behind me and beside me that might also have something to add to this as well, having quite a bit of knowledge on the Clean Water Act. But with the Clean Water Act and the way the EPA works, there's certain standards that need to be met to regulate a chemical, and pharmaceuticals don't currently fall into the category that would regulate certain chemicals, let's say from a lethality endpoint. So if they're running a study to see what a chemical does and at what concentration could it be lethal, that doesn't apply to pharmaceuticals because they're not killing these organisms, but as I mentioned, they're having these behavioral alterations. So there are a few precedents where they're trying to incorporate behavioral endpoints in regulating a chemical, and they've done this with bees, when they've seen the behavior of bees change and how that could be affecting pollination. But that's one of the main hurdles, I would say, when it comes to pharmaceuticals, when we want to enact change with how they are in our environment.
Any additional?
Real briefly, it just takes, I think, an incredibly long time to identify a threat and then regulate it, and then deregulate it, let's say, once it's become effectively addressed. So, and then by the time you regulate a chemical, which then would make it fall within, let's say, the Clean Water Act, where they could enforce it, then there's probably 100 other chemicals that are, emerging. So it's a complicated, challenging field.
I just want to add that the state of Florida also recently is putting out a proposed rule to allow us to drink our own wastewater. So that would be a direct connect to all the things that you heard about today about PFAS in our drinking water. So Waterkeepers Florida is putting out information about that, and we are actively putting in comments about how we need to change that in a way that would safeguard our health. So there's a lot of questions about what else are you going to test for pharmaceuticals, because people are really like wanting to know about dolphins and other things. And then there are a lot of questions about like what are some of the health impacts. Has there been an increase or is there a known increase in autism or dementia because of PFAS? And so those will be our last two questions unless somebody else really wants to ask one. So first, what else are people testing for pharmaceuticals in Florida waters?
So in Florida waters, we focused on the marine and coastal environment, which does have a little bit of a lack when it's compared to freshwater and riverine ecosystems for testing for pharmaceuticals. And there have been studies looking at mosquito fish in reclaimed water and how they have pharmaceuticals in them. We are still a little nascent when it comes to looking at the pharmaceuticals in the state of Florida, but one thing that we are doing is developing an understanding that it does extend beyond just the aquatic environment, because that's what I spoke about here. But let's say we're in a river and we have emerging insects, and those insects would be exposed to the pharmaceuticals and then eaten by riverine mesopredators, so that could expand beyond there. So it's not just contained to our waterways. It's something that can extend beyond that. And I'll open that up to Dr. Bowden there.
So health impacts.
Yeah, so there's a large increasing amount of literature focused on almost any ailment you can think of. I don't know anything specifically about the ones mentioned. A lot of the work that's been done from a toxicological standpoint, and there's not a lot for a lot of the chemicals that exist, is done with animal models. And it's incredibly difficult to translate some of those findings to human exposures, in particular because as humans, we use these products our whole lifetime. So how do you reconcile a lifetime of exposure versus those you get acutely every day? So it's really difficult to unravel the specific things that they're doing, and they're very promiscuous in the body, so they attack a lot of different pathways. So we basically have to keep trying to do a lot of these models to try to understand what all these chemicals do, but the evidence is definitely concerning. That's the best I can say right now.
So unfortunately, we are 6 minutes behind schedule. So if you have a question for our wonderful speakers, they'll be around. But I just want to make sure that we give them a very nice round of applause for their great presentation. Thank you, Dr. Bowden. Thank you, Nick. And thank you, Justin. So we're almost done here for the day, but we could not leave without thanking the Bradenton Yacht Club and thanking Joe McClash. But we want to thank Joe McClash more than just me saying these words. So I'm going to bring up Rusty and Justin, and we're going to present our first Water Warrior Award.
Thank you, and I need another special helper. Come on up. Come over here with Rusty. And you guys hold this, okay? Come over here where they can see. So this is the first of what we hope to be an annual award that we give to someone special in our community who's a real water warrior. And for me, it was obvious that Joe McClash should be the first one. And here I'm sitting at the table with a lot on my mind and thinking, I got to come up with something nice to say about Joe. So I wrote down a list of accomplishments. And I write really small. So I know, and I think amongst these tables, if you guys think of other things, share them with your neighbors. But I know Joe as a public servant. He's a Marine. He's a longtime commissioner, a Manatee County commissioner and politician. He's a publisher. He is a businessman. He's a family man. He's got a lot of family around here. He's a pilot who flies with the Coast Guard Auxiliary as well as being a private pilot. He is a yachtsman. He was the Commodore for many years here at the Bradenton Yacht Club. And I know Joe the most, besides being a friend, as incredible environmental advocate. And for that, we want to present him with this Water Warrior Award. Joe is incredibly effective at all the things that I was talking about, but as an environmental advocate, I've had the privilege of working with him, and he's taught me a lot about how to be a water warrior. Because Joe is, he's dogged, I think is a good word for it, and incredibly effective. So I can't think of anybody better to hold the banner as our first Suncoast Waterkeeper, Water Warrior, and it's our privilege to present Joe McClash with this award. Thank you.
Joe, I have a couple things I want to say before you, but I had the privilege, actually, of taking over as board chair for Suncoast Waterkeeper. And Joe he's not board chair anymore, he's not on the board, but he is still active with this organization. And I'm really, really, really pleased with that, because it's very big shoes to fill, I can tell you that. And so I would just like to join all of you in thanking Joe and welcoming him for our first award. Appreciate it.
Well, I just want to thank everybody in this room as well as the community that supports the environment. We couldn't really do the work that we do without people like you stepping forward, truly advocates. I look out there at the seawall, and we have one of these hardened seawalls, and one of the things I proposed to the yacht club, let's make that a mangrove fringe along that wall. And we have this one mangrove that's struggling right now to come. That's our first mangrove, but hopefully you come back here in a few years and that whole shoreline will be full of mangroves. So, it's the little things like collecting all the seeds of the mangroves and just putting them over there in the rocks and hoping one survives. And talking to our Commodore 2 years ago, it's like, I got this crazy idea. We need to make that a mangrove shoreline because it's a natural buffer for the yacht club, storm prevention, all the good things that we have about mangroves. So it's those little things that we do that also make a big difference. And I've just been honored to serve as a Suncoast Waterkeeper. Justin founded this organization, and I'm proud of where it is today with the organization and having Abby as the director. And also, my daughter is the chairman of the Tampa Bay Waterkeeper. So she's here with us. A funny story there is that their board up in Tampa decided not to want to do the Waterkeeper board, so we became their caretaker board, I called it. And so our board became Tampa Bay Waterkeeper board, and with the goal of transitioning. And so they have a great board up there, and Megan was invited to join the board, and after asking her to chair like one meeting, she became the chairman right away. So. But it just shows you the culture of the community here as far as with people interested in the environment. And I just hope that you keep up, attending these events and doing your part locally. I'm very impressed with all the speakers and the scientists that we had here today, and it's just amazing the amount of work we have left to do to leave the environment a little bit better for the future generations. So thanks for this award. I appreciate it.